The night air on Guadalcanal hung thick with moisture and the smell of rotting vegetation, and somewhere in that darkness, 200 young Marines were about to discover that survival sometimes depends on breaking the rules. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Griffith crouched in a waterlogged foxhole, pressing a radio handset against his ear with fingers that trembled not from fear, but from exhaustion so complete it had become a physical weight. His battalion had been pinned down for 6 hours by a series of reinforced Japanese positions that conventional weapons simply could not penetrate, and the casualties were mounting with a mathematical precision that made his stomach turn. Every third man in his command had been hit by nightfall, and now, with darkness complete and the enemy beginning their inevitable counterattack, Griffith faced a decision that would either save his men or end his career. In his remaining ammunition crates sat several thousand rounds of experimental incendiary, ammunition that had been explicitly prohibited by field commanders 3 months earlier. The rounds had been deemed too dangerous, too unpredictable, and too likely to cause political complications if their use became public knowledge. But those considerations belonged to a different world than the one Griffith now inhabited. A world where men in clean uniforms made pronouncements about appropriate force from the safety of headquarters buildings that had walls and roofs and floors that didn't leak. Here in the jungle, appropriate force meant anything that kept your men breathing until sunrise. The story of how those prohibited rounds came to exist, why they were banned, and how they changed the tactical landscape of the Pacific War in a single night is a tale that begins not in the steaming hellscape of the Solomon Islands, but in the antiseptic quiet of an Aberdeen proving ground laboratory where a civilian chemist named Thomas Riddell was attempting to solve a problem that traditional military thinking insisted did not exist. Riddell had spent his career before the war working for a chemical manufacturing concern in Pennsylvania, where his primary responsibility involved making industrial processes slightly more efficient in ways that saved companies fractional percentages on their quarterly expenses. It was unglamorous work that required a particular kind of mind, one capable of obsessing over minute variations in temperature and mixture ratios with a focus that most people reserved for matters of love or faith. When the Army recruited him in early 1942, they did so not because they needed his specific expertise, but because they needed warm bodies with chemistry degrees who could follow established protocols for manufacturing munitions. The military-industrial complex was expanding at a rate that defied comprehension, and the demand for technically competent personnel far exceeded the supply of individuals who had actually trained for weapons development. What the Army did not anticipate was that Riddell would refuse to simply follow protocols. Within 3 months of his arrival at Aberdeen, he had begun questioning the fundamental assumptions underlying standard ammunition design, particularly the belief that increased penetration and increased incendiary effect existed in inverse proportion to one another. Traditional thinking held that a bullet designed to pierce armor or reinforce positions needed to maintain structural integrity, which meant using harder metals and minimizing the internal space available for incendiary compounds. Conversely, rounds designed primarily for fire starting needed to be softer and contain more chemical payload, which inherently reduced their ability to penetrate hardened targets. Riddell's innovation, such as it was, emerged not from genius but from a kind of systematic stubbornness. He began experimenting with compound layering techniques that allowed the projectile to maintain penetration characteristics during the initial impact phase, while ensuring that the incendiary core would ignite with maximum effect once inside the target structure. The key breakthrough involved using a temperature-sensitive trigger compound that remained inert during barrel transit and impact, but activated upon exposure to the specific heat condition present inside wooden or earthen fortifications after penetration. In practical terms, this meant the round would punch through a bunker wall and then explode into white-hot chemical fire on the other side. The first successful test occurred on a humid afternoon in July 1942, when a single prototype round fired into a mock-up of a Japanese defensive position created a thermal bloom that consumed the entire structure in less than 4 seconds. Riddell watched through protective glass as the wooden beams supporting the target bunker began to warp and collapse, and he felt a complicated mixture of professional satisfaction and deep unease about what he had created. The round worked exactly as designed, which meant it would be extraordinarily effective at killing human beings in ways that were difficult to watch and potentially difficult to justify under the existing conventions governing acceptable military force. When Riddell submitted his findings to the Army's Ordnance Evaluation Board, the response was immediate and enthusiastic. Here was a potential solution to one of the most persistent tactical problems facing American forces in the Pacific theater. Japanese defensive positions were typically constructed with remarkable attention to protective design, using layers of coconut logs and packed earth that could withstand direct hits from standard ammunition without significant degradation. American infantry units were routinely suffering severe casualties attempting to neutralize these positions with conventional weapons, and the flamethrower teams that might have provided an alternative were themselves extremely vulnerable to enemy fire during their approach. A rifle round that could achieve similar incendiary effects from standard engagement ranges represented a genuine tactical revolution. But even as the Ordnance Board was celebrating Riddell's achievement, other elements within the military bureaucracy were expressing concern. The Legal Affairs Division of the War Department raised immediate questions about whether the rounds violated existing international agreements regarding incendiary weapons. The Geneva Conventions, while not explicitly prohibiting incendiary ammunition, had established a general framework emphasizing that weapons should not cause unnecessary suffering, and there was genuine uncertainty about whether ammunition designed specifically to start uncontrollable fires inside enclosed defensive positions would be considered acceptable under that standard. The political calculus was further complicated by the propaganda value that Japanese authorities might extract from American use of what they could characterize as inhumane weapons. Throughout 1942 and into 1943, both sides in the Pacific War were engaged in sustained information campaigns designed to portray their enemies as barbaric violators of civilized warfare norms. The Japanese government had been particularly effective in using reports of American incendiary bombing raids on civilian targets to bolster domestic morale and justify their own military actions as defensive necessity, providing them with evidence of American troops using specialized burning ammunition against defensive positions. Even legitimate military targets risked undermining American moral authority at a time when maintaining international support remained crucial. The compromise that emerged from these competing considerations reflected the kind of bureaucratic logic that produces decisions nobody actually wants but everyone can theoretically live with. The Army would proceed with limited production of Riddell's incendiary rounds, manufacturing enough to supply several Marine battalions that would soon be deploying to the Solomon Islands campaign. However, field commanders were instructed that the ammunition was to be considered experimental and was not to be employed in combat operations without explicit authorization from higher command. This authorization process was deliberately designed to be cumbersome and time-consuming, requiring written justification that would need to route through multiple levels of command before approval could be granted. In practical terms, this meant the ammunition would be shipped to the Pacific, distributed to units that might benefit from its use, and then sit unused in ammunition depots while those same units fought desperate battles with conventional weapons that were inadequate for the task. The logic underlying this approach was that if the rounds proved absolutely necessary in some future crisis, they would be available, but their restricted status would provide the War Department with plausible deniability about their widespread employment. Lieutenant Colonel Griffith became aware of the experimental ammunition's existence in late October 1942, when a supply officer mentioned during a routine briefing that several crates of restricted incendiary rounds had been included in the battalion's most recent ammunition shipment. The supply officer described them with the kind of careful neutrality that suggested he understood the political sensitivity surrounding their presence, noting that they were not to be distributed to rifle companies without explicit permission from regimental commander. Griffith, who had at that point been in the Solomon Islands for nearly 8 weeks and had already lost more men to Japanese bunker positions than to any other single cause, made note of where the crates were stored and said nothing further about them in any official capacity. What Griffith understood, and what the men who had drafted the restrictions on the ammunition's use perhaps did not fully grasp, was that combat operations rarely provided the luxury of time required for formal authorization process. Battles in the jungle did not pause while requests for permission to use specific ammunition types were routed through command channel. Men died while waiting for approvals that might never come, and the officers responsible for those men learned very quickly that following proper procedure often meant accepting casualties that might have been prevented through more aggressive action. The position where Griffith's battalion found itself trapped on the night of November 3rd had been designated Hill 173 on military maps, though the Marines who fought there would remember it by more colorful names that referenced both its topography and the intensity of the fighting required to approach it. The hill was not particularly high, barely qualifying as an elevation at all by any standard except that of the surrounding terrain, but it commanded a crucial section of trail that American forces needed to control in order to advance their supply lines deeper into the island's interior. Japanese engineers had recognized the position's tactical value and had constructed a network of mutually supporting bunkers that covered every approach with interlocking fields of fire. Griffith's orders had been straightforward in the way that orders often are when delivered by commanders who will not personally face the consequence of following them. His battalion was to seize Hill 173 and secure it against counterattack, preferably with minimal casualties, and definitely before the onset of the rainy season made further offensive operations impractical. The orders did not specify how this was to be accomplished against positions that had already repulsed 2 previous American assaults, but military planning at the operational level rarely concerns itself with such tactical minutiae. The assault began just after dawn, with 3 rifle companies advancing in coordinated movements designed to overwhelm the Japanese defenders through simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. The theory was sound in the abstract, based on principles of fire and maneuver that had been validated in numerous training exercises and previous engagement. But theory collapses when confronted with the reality of defensive positions constructed by men who understood that their survival depended on making those positions impregnable. The Japanese bunkers had been built with narrow firing slits that provided excellent visibility while presenting minimal target area, and their positioning ensured that any force approaching one bunker would be exposed to fire from at least 2 others. Within 20 minutes of the assault's commencement, Griffith's lead companies had suffered casualties approaching 30% without making any significant progress toward the objective. Men were pinned down in whatever depressions or behind whatever fallen logs offered minimal protection, unable to advance and increasingly unable even to return effective fire against enemies they could barely. The battalion's machine gun teams attempted to provide suppressing fire, but their efforts proved largely futile against fortifications designed to withstand exactly this kind of conventional assault. Artillery support, which might have provided a solution, was unavailable due to concerns about friendly fire given the close proximity of American and Japanese positions. By midday, Griffith had committed his reserve company and had achieved exactly nothing except a higher casualty. The battalion aid station was overwhelmed with wounded men, many suffering from injuries that would have been survivable with rapid evacuation, but became increasingly critical as hours passed without any possibility of medical transport. The corpsmen worked with a desperate efficiency that came from knowing that every man they saved was offset by 2 more arriving with wounds that required immediate attention they could not provide. As afternoon stretched into evening, Griffith faced the recognition that the objective would not be taken, and continuing to attempt its seizure with conventional tactics would simply result in additional casualties without altering the fundamental impossibility of the tactical situation. The appropriate decision, the decision that a responsible officer should make, was to order a withdrawal under cover of darkness and report to higher command that the position could not be taken without significant additional resources. This was the decision that would preserve his remaining force, minimize further bloodshed, and align with every principle of sound tactical judgment he had learned throughout his military career. But Griffith also understood what would happen after that withdrawal. Another battalion would be ordered to attempt the same assault, and those men would die in the same ways his men had died, achieving the same lack of result. The Japanese positions would remain intact until someone decided to commit the kind of overwhelming force necessary to neutralize them through sheer weight of numbers. and that force would be paid for in casualties that could be measured in dozens or hundreds of young men who would never return home. The experimental ammunition sat in its crates perhaps 200 yards behind the current line, close enough that it could be distributed to rifle companies within an hour if Griffith gave the order. Using it without authorization would represent a clear violation of the restrictions that had been placed on its employment. And if the operation resulted in anything other than complete success, Griffith could expect to face serious consequences ranging from formal reprimand to court-martial. But if it worked, if Riddell's incendiary rounds could accomplish what conventional ammunition could not, then the position would be taken, and the lives saved would justify the violation of protocols that suddenly seemed abstract and disconnected from the reality of men bleeding out in jungle mud. Griffith made his decision with a kind of clarity that emerges when all alternatives have been exhausted. He radioed his company commanders with instructions to prepare for a night assault using specialized ammunition that would be distributed immediately. He did not elaborate on the nature of that ammunition or discuss the authorization status of its use, and his officers did not ask questions because they understood that some decisions are better left unexamined until after their consequences become apparent. The distribution of the incendiary rounds occurred with remarkable efficiency, suggesting that Griffith was not the only member of his command who had been considering their potential use. Squad leaders briefed their men with instructions that were deliberately vague about exactly what made this ammunition different from standard ball rounds, emphasizing only that the new rounds should be directed specifically at the firing slits of enemy bunkers, and that their effects would become apparent immediately upon successful hits. Most of the Marines accepted this information without comment, too exhausted and too focused on survival to waste energy questioning the source of anything that might provide tactical advantage. The assault commenced at 2200 hours, launched under conditions of complete darkness that the Marines hoped would allow them to close with the Japanese positions before being detected. The plan relied on speed and surprise rather than preparatory bombardment, with individual fire teams advancing in short rushes, while designated marksmen provided covering fire aimed specifically at the bunker apertures that had proven so deadly during the daylight assault. The first several minutes of the attack proceeded in near silence, broken only by the soft sounds of men moving through underbrush and the occasional whispered instruction from squad leaders directing their team's movements. The first incendiary round found its target at approximately 2207 minutes, when a private from Georgia, whose name was Henderson, managed to place a shot directly through the firing slit of the nearest Japanese bunker. Henderson would later report that he observed the muzzle flash of his rifle and then, approximately 2 seconds later, witnessed a bloom of intense white light erupting from inside the fortification. The light was bright enough to see clearly even from his position 30 yards distant, and it was accompanied by a sound that Henderson described as similar to a gas stove, igniting but magnified to a volume that seemed impossible for something happening inside an enclosed space. The effect on the Japanese defenders inside that bunker was immediate and catastrophic. The incendiary compound, now activated by the heat conditions present after penetration of the reinforced walls, achieved temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees within the confined interior space. The defenders had perhaps 3 seconds to realize what was happening before the thermal bloom consumed all available oxygen and converted the bunker from a protective position into a cremation chamber. Those who might have survived the initial ignition found themselves trapped inside a structure that had suddenly become a furnace, with no possibility of escape and no time to even attempt reaching the exits before unconsciousness overtook them. Henderson's successful shot was followed within seconds by a dozen more as other Marines, witnessing the dramatic effect of the incendiary rounds, began directing their fire with renewed focus at the remaining bunker position. Each successful hit produced the same characteristic white bloom, and within 5 minutes of the assault's commencement, the entire defensive network that had resisted American forces for more than 12 hours was effectively neutralized. The Japanese positions that had been impregnable when defended by men capable of returning fire became little more than burning tombs. Once those defenders were removed from the equation, Griffith's Marines reached the summit of hill 173 at 2231 minutes, having advanced the final 100 yards against essentially no resistance. The few Japanese soldiers who had survived the initial incendiary assault either withdrew immediately or died attempting to defend positions that no longer offered any tactical advantage. By 2300 hours, the hill was secured, and Griffith was establishing a defensive perimeter to guard against the inevitable counterattack the Japanese doctrine dictated would come before dawn. The counterattack, when it materialized shortly after midnight, followed the predictable pattern of Japanese night operations in the Guadalcanal campaign. Infantry units supported by light machine guns attempted to reclaim the lost position through direct assault, relying on speed and aggression to overcome American defensive preparation. But Griffith's men now occupied the same fortified positions that had served the Japanese so effectively, and they still possessed substantial quantities of the incendiary ammunition that had proven so devastatingly effective during the initial assault. The attacking Japanese forces found themselves advancing into fields of fire that could not be suppressed or avoided. And when individual soldiers managed to reach the American position, they were met with point-blank fire that included liberal use of rounds that could convert cover into liability within seconds. The counterattack collapsed after approximately 40 minutes, having achieved nothing except the addition of Japanese casualties to a battlefield already saturated with the evidence of modern warfare's industrial efficiency. Griffith's battalion had held Hill 173 and done so with casualties significantly lighter than those suffered during the initial daylight assault. The experimental ammunition had performed exactly as Thomas Riddell had designed it to perform, achieving penetration and incendiary effects that conventional weapons could not match. As dawn broke on November 4th, and Griffith began the process of consolidating his position and evacuating wounded men who had been waiting through the night for medical attention, he also began preparing the after-action report that would need to explain how his battalion had accomplished an objective that two previous attempts had failed to achieve. The report would need to detail the tactical decisions made, the casualties suffered, and the ammunition expended during the operation. It would also need to address the fact that several thousand rounds of explicitly restricted incendiary ammunition had been employed without the authorization that regulations required. Griffith chose to present these facts with a directness that left no room for ambiguity or misinterpretation. His report noted that conventional ammunition had proven ineffective against reinforced Japanese positions, that casualties were mounting to unsustainable levels, and that the decision to employ experimental incendiary rounds had been made as a tactical necessity to prevent further loss of American lives. He did not apologize for this decision or attempt to minimize its implications, recognizing that any attempt to obscure what had occurred would only create additional complications when the truth inevitably emerged. The response from higher command arrived 3 days later and reflected the complicated political calculations that had surrounded the incendiary ammunition from its inception. Griffith was neither commended nor formally reprimanded for his decision to use restricted ammunition without authorization. Instead, he received a carefully worded communication noting that while proper authorization procedures should be followed in future operation, battlefield commanders were expected to exercise appropriate judgment in responding to tactical situations that could not have been anticipated by higher headquarters. This was military bureaucracy's way of acknowledging that Griffith had achieved a significant tactical success while simultaneously preserving the official fiction that unauthorized use of experimental weapons remained unacceptable. The more significant response came not in official communications, but in material actions that reflected changing attitudes toward Riddell's incendiary rounds. Within 2 weeks of Griffith's operation on Hill 173, the restrictions on the ammunition's use were quietly modified to allow battalion-level commanders discretionary authority in employing it against hardened defensive positions. Production quantities were increased substantially, and distribution expanded to include Army units in addition to the Marine battalions that had received the initial shipments. The rounds that had been considered too dangerous and too politically sensitive to use freely suddenly became standard issue for forces operating throughout the Pacific theater. This transformation occurred without any formal announcement or policy statement acknowledging that previous restrictions had been misguided. The military establishment simply adapted to new information about what worked in combat conditions, and the bureaucratic apparatus that had initially resisted the ammunition's deployment now became its most enthusiastic proponent. Staff officers who had written memoranda questioning the legal and ethical implications of incendiary rounds in September were drafting tactical bulletins about their optimal employment by December, and nobody seemed to recognize any contradiction in this evolution. Thomas Riddell learned about the successful use of his ammunition, not through official channels but through a letter from a Marine captain who had heard about the chemist's role in developing the rounds and wanted to express gratitude on behalf of men whose lives had been saved by their untold availability. The letter described in straightforward terms what the incendiary rounds had accomplished on Hill 173, and it concluded with a simple statement that Riddell would remember for the remainder of his life. The captain wrote that whatever concerns might exist about the ammunition's effects, those concerns paled in comparison to the alternative of watching men die attempting to neutralize positions that conventional weapons could not touch. Riddell filed the letter in his desk and returned to work on incremental improvements to the incendiary compound's stability and performance characteristics. He did not discuss the ethical questions surrounding his creation with colleagues or superiors, recognizing that those questions had already been answered through the brutal calculus of combat necessity. Men with rifles needed tools that allowed them to survive encounters with enemies who were equally determined and equally well prepared. And if the tools created by chemists in laboratory settings proved effective in meeting that need, then questions about their appropriateness became academic exercises divorced from the reality of men fighting for their survival in circumstances that permitted no margin for philosophical contemplation. The incendiary rounds continued to be manufactured throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, with production eventually reaching several million rounds per month by mid-1944. They became a standard component of the ammunition load carried by American infantry units operating in any theater where enemy fortifications presented significant tactical challenges. After-action reports from dozens of engagements documented their effectiveness against Japanese bunkers, Korean defensive positions, and even German fortifications during the final months of the European campaign. The rounds that had been banned as too dangerous and too controversial became simply another tool in the arsenal that industrial democracies could bring to bear against enemies who had chosen to contest their power. The story of these rounds illuminates truths about warfare that exist independent of any specific conflict or technological development. Combat is ultimately about problem-solving under conditions of extreme stress and limited information, where the consequences of failure are measured in human lives rather than abstract metrics. The tools and techniques that prove successful in this environment are those that address immediate tactical needs, regardless of whether they align with pre-existing doctrinal preferences or bureaucratic comfort levels. Innovation emerges not from systematic planning, but from the collision of practical problems with individuals willing to question established assumptions. And the gap between laboratory success and field employment is often bridged not through official channels, but through the unauthorized decisions of commanders who understand that preserving their men's lives takes precedence over preserving their own careers. Lieutenant Colonel Griffith survived the war and eventually achieved the rank of brigadier general, though his career progression was notably slower than that of peers who had demonstrated more consistent adherence to proper authorization procedures. He never expressed regret about his decision to employ experimental ammunition without permission, but he also never spoke publicly about that decision in ways that might have embarrassed the institutional military that had created the situation requiring such choices. In retirement, he wrote extensively about small unit tactics and the psychological pressures facing combat leaders, and those who read his work carefully could detect oblique references to the night on Hill 173 when breaking regulations saved 200 men who would otherwise have died attempting impossible tasks with inadequate tools. Thomas Riddell returned to civilian life after the war and resumed work in industrial chemistry, spending 3 decades improving manufacturing processes with the same systematic focus he had applied to ammunition design. He received no public recognition for developing the incendiary rounds that proved so effective in the Pacific, in part because the military establishment preferred not to draw attention to weapons whose use might invite international criticism. In private conversations with family members, he occasionally mentioned his war work in terms that suggested complicated feelings about having created something that killed enemy soldiers with particular efficiency. But he also maintained that refusing to develop effective weapons would not have prevented the killing. It would only have ensured that more Americans died alongside the enemy casualties that war inevitably produced. The incendiary rounds themselves became largely forgotten in the decades following the war, superseded by more sophisticated weapon systems and rendered obsolete by changing tactical doctrines that emphasize different approaches to neutralizing fortified positions. Military historians studying the Pacific Campaign occasionally noted their use in specific engagements, but the ammunition never achieved the iconic status of technologies like radar or the atomic bomb that commanded public attention and historical analysis. They remained a footnote in the larger narrative of how industrial societies mobilized technological innovation in service of military, significant primarily to the men whose lives they saved and whose names appear nowhere in historical records except as statistics in casualty reports. The Tuareg might have been longer absent their availability. The night on Hill 173 stands as a moment when the abstractions of military policy collided with the concrete reality of men trapped in situations where following regulation meant accepting preventable death. Griffith's decision to ignore those regulations in favor of immediate tactical necessity reflects a truth about combat leadership that exists independent of specific circumstances. Officers responsible for men's lives face choices that cannot be made by reference to procedure or doctrine, and the quality that distinguishes effective leaders from merely competent ones is often the willingness to accept personal consequences in exchange for their subordinates' survival. The banned ammunition that saved 200 Marines represents not just a technological solution to a tactical problem, but a reminder that wars are won through the accumulated decisions of individuals willing to prioritize mission success and personnel preservation over institutional preference. That may have seemed reasonable in contexts far removed from the chaos of actual combat. In the end, the story circles back to a fundamental question about how societies prepare for and conduct warfare. The experimental rounds that military bureaucracy initially banned as too dangerous and too politically problematic proved essential for accomplishing missions that could not be achieved through conventional means. The delay in authorizing their use cost lives that need not have been lost, and the ultimate decision to employ them came not through proper channels, but through the unauthorized action of a field commander who understood that some rules exist to be broken when following them would result in catastrophic outcomes. This pattern has repeated throughout military history and will continue repeating as long as wars are fought by human beings facing situations that laboratory conditions cannot anticipate and headquarters planning cannot fully comprehend. The Marines who survived that night on Guadalcanal because Samuel Griffith decided regulations mattered less than their lives went on to fight in other campaigns and eventually returned home to build civilian lives in a country that never fully understood what they had experienced or what had been Denken Zur required to ensure their survival. Most never knew that the ammunition that saved them had been explicitly prohibited, or that using it represented an act of institutional disobedience that might have ended their commander's career. They simply knew that the Japanese bunkers that had seemed impregnable during daylight assaults had burned like paper once darkness fell, and different ammunition began finding its mark, and they were grateful for whatever combination of factors had made that transformation possible. History remembers the great battles and the strategic decisions that shaped the war's outcome, but victory emerged from thousands of smaller moments when individual choices determined whether specific men lived or died. The banned bullets that burned through Japanese bunkers represent one such moment, significant not because they changed the war's ultimate outcome, but because they changed the outcome for 200 men whose survival mattered absolutely to them and to the families who would have mourned their loss. That Thomas Riddell created them, that military bureaucracy tried to restrict them, and that Samuel Griffith used them anyway, tells us something essential about how innovation occurs. how institutions resist change even when change serves their stated purpose, and how the gap between policy and practice gets bridged by individuals willing to accept responsibility for decisions that proper procedure cannot accommodate. The incendiary rounds existed because a chemist refused to accept that penetration and thermal effects could not be optimized simultaneously. They were banned because officials concerned with legal compliance and political optics could not distinguish between weapons that caused unnecessary suffering and weapons that simply caused suffering efficiently. They were used because a combat commander understood that his obligation to preserve his men's lives superseded his obligation to follow restrictions that made sense only in contexts disconnected from the reality of men dying in jungle darkness. And they saved lives because sometimes the difference between survival and death comes down to having the right tool at the right moment, regardless of whether proper authorization existed for its employment. This is not the story that appears in official histories or commemorative narratives, but it is the story that matters to anyone interested in understanding how wars are actually fought by actual human beings making impossible choices and conditions that permit no margin for error and no time for error and no time for consultation with authorities who are not present to share the consequences of their decisions.